Good day, folks. My name is Alan from Season 10 of Alone. Today's video, Alone Season 11, Episode 7 Recap. Let's get into it. Folks, I got some bad news. I forgot my tripod. So my camera is like balanced on a tree branch right in front of me here, blocking the sun. It may look normal to you right now, but I'm actually like a giraffe at a water hole. There are 5 people remaining at the start of this episode. So the first scene of this episode starts with Isaiah. Now Isaiah found that gill net last episode and he's got it untangled and he's got it set up on a long pole and he's about to place it in the water. Now that gill net looks awesome. I was really excited to see him set it out in the river and see what it produced. Unfortunately, Isaiah is still struggling with his chest pains. Last episode I said producers are trying to get you to think things aren't true. They were kind of making Isaiah seem like he was thinking about tapping out, but I didn't believe them because they usually do that and then that person continues further into the game, and man, was I wrong. So right away he's complaining about his chest pains again, and he talks about how he has high blood pressure and high cholesterol and he's seriously worried about his health. And he's considering tapping. He notices a flock of geese flying overhead and he takes that as a sign from his brother that it's time to go home. Isaiah calls into production and takes himself out of the game because he's worried about health complications and doesn't want any long-term impacts from playing the game. It's day 23 and we are down to 4 people left in the game. The episode moves on to Timber, and he's peeking out of the shelter and he sees a cow moose and a calf moose in front of him in the meadow. Man, what a special moment. You can really see how uplifting that was for Timber in this episode. And those little positive moments that you see out there, like the game that you see, a flock of geese flying overhead, whatever it is, those little moments of, I guess, the gifts that nature gives you can be really good for your mental attitude and can really help you go a long way in the game. And showing gratitude out there also keeps your mental game strong. On season 10, one night I remember I was plucking a grouse at the side of the lake. It was kind of dusk and I had my tripod on me. I'm just talking to the camera and I noticed something in the water, a series of things swimming towards me. And I thought, what are those ducks doing? There's not usually ducks swimming at dusk. And the lake was so calm, I could see the V that they were creating as they're swimming towards me. And as I got closer, I noticed it was a family of otters. And I just sat quietly and they actually swam right in front of me, maybe 10, 15 yards. And one of them finally noticed me and they were making all these weird vocalizations. If you've never heard otters make vocalizations, they certainly do. And it's a really weird sound. I'm not even gonna try to imitate them right now. But one of them like reared out of the water and was like swimming with his tail. It was way up out of the water, maybe 15 yards in front of me, and just staring at me, and it was a real magical moment. Unfortunately, when I went back to turn my camera off, I never turned it on. So all that awesome footage was totally missed on my bad. When I told the producers about that, they weren't overly happy with me. I missed a really good shot. So Timber's continuing to fortify and work on a shelter. He builds his bed, and as he's doing so, he cuts himself through his leather gloves. And that's awesome that he was wearing his gloves when he was doing that, because if he didn't have his gloves on, I imagine that silky saw, which are like razor sharp, would have really caused a serious injury that potentially could have taken him out of the game. He seals it up with some spruce sap. Spruce sap can kind of work like the glue that you get in the hospital. It kind of seals it shut, protects it, and it also has some antibacterial and antifungal agents in it as well. It's super important to be mindful and careful when you're out there. In every little thing that you do, because any little tiny mistake that can result in an injury, even something small that could potentially get infected, can end up taking you out of the game. He also makes a comment about how he's not feeling like he's on his A game, that he's got this brain fog going on. And when he said that, I totally related to a day I had near the end when obviously I wasn't eating enough and I did have brain fog. I went back and forth to my shelter throughout the day numerous times because I kept forgetting like these silly little things. I'd forget my knife, or I'd forget my headlamp, or I'd forget my tripod. I was just going back and forth, wasting all this energy because my brain wasn't working correctly that day. I totally understood what he was talking about. Timber knows that his main work is done and he just needs to slow down and relax and save some calories. The next scene shows Timber in his shelter. He's awake and he's hearing these wolves howling all night. I mean, the same thing happened to Isaiah. It was either last episode or the episode before that, but laying in your shelter made out of natural resources that you've made, and listening to these wolves howling it's a really surreal, kind of magical, and sometimes a little bit scary experience. He talks about how he's not worried about wolves for his safety, but he is worried about the wolves finding his cache of meat. He wakes up in the morning, he heads outside, and he finds tracks right in front of his shelter. He follows them for a bit, and he goes to check out his old kill site. And he's surprised to find that that big rib cage that he's left was gone. The audience knew what happened to that rib cage because they showed it in the previews for, I don't know, I think since the very beginning, a large grizzly grabbing that rib cage and just dragging it off. So he didn't know, but we knew. But he correctly assumed it was a bear. And as he's walking around, he kind of got this eerie feeling. He's looking around, and he knows that that bear is probably close, and he gets this weird feeling. He feels a little bit unsafe, so he wisely heads back to his shelter. Yeah, heading back to a kill site, you know, days or however long it was, a week later, not the best idea, because there'll definitely be predators moving in and out of that area. So the next scene was pretty funny. He talks about the strategy he's employing for keeping predators, mostly bears, away from his camp and his food cache, obviously. He finds an old dead stick, he pees on it, so the stick will absorb the scent of his urine. And the message he wants to send to bears and other predators is that there was already somebody here and wants to like put the scent of man in that stick to let other animals know that this spot is his and no trespassing. So just to speak a little bit about that, it's not going to do any harm, and it might make him feel better mentally about being safe, but bears aren't going to care if there's a stick with some urine on it, because we know bears break into cabins, they break into cars, they'll break into your garage. All those things are covered with the scent of man. So I'm going to bet that if a grizzly is aware of his food cache, that pea stick probably isn't going to have an impact on that bear's decision. But I'm still not sure if Timber's just kind of joking about it or being serious, but we'll have to see what happens. It's day 29. Timber's enjoying a beautiful morning in his spot, and you can really tell that the weather is starting to change. It's cold, it's frosty, and it just looks like very pre-wintry, and that it could possibly snow at any time. Later on in the episode, they also show the Dub's pond in front of the shelter is starting to freeze around the edges. Winter is coming. So Timber continues to work on his shelter. He's got this plethora of dead swamp grass in his area close to his shelter. So he's collecting all the swamp grass, and he's thatching his roof, starting from the bottom, just to add extra water protection and insulation. Timber shelter looks so solid and it looks so good. I'm really impressed by the quality of his shelter. Even though it took him a lot of energy to build it and the logs are huge, it's done now, and he's got all that moose meat. Man, that shelter is prime. Timber's next scene was filming like this ritualistic celebration of hanging his moose antlers on his cabin. It was pretty funny. You know, he did a pretty good job back and forth filming it for our entertainment. My favorite part was that dancing he was doing with his hands over his head. It was really funny. I was laughing out loud during that whole scene. Good job, Timber. That was funny. Up next was William. He's harvesting some rose hips, and he finds a bottle that he's excited about because he wants to use that bottle as a nighttime bed pot. You gotta agree that William is super good at keeping that positive mindset. I know I've spoken about it before, but it seems like every time you're watching William, he's happy, he's positive, and he's upbeat, even when things aren't going great. He retrieves his bag of fish, and he eats the last of his whitefish. William knows he's scarce on food, so he really needs to focus on food procurement and decides to set up a few more snares. William's busy reinforcing his shelter. He looks up and he notices a flock of geese flying south. He takes a moment and just takes it all in, and the scene that's in front of him is just absolutely beautiful. And again, that just speaks to William showing gratitude for all the little gifts that nature is giving him. And I can't say how important being a little bit thankful and showing gratitude for all those little great things that happen to you during the day, or the things that you see, how that's so important for keeping your mind strong in the game. William builds a lure, heads down to the river, and catches himself a little pike. Now this pike is super important for him, and he's very grateful because up until that point, he was totally out of food. William heads out to check his snares, and he finds a nice hare in one of his snares. He brings it back, he processes it, and he cooks up, he eats half of it. It actually looked really good, and I love watching the contestants eating, because man, I've been there, and even though it doesn't look very appetizing, there's no salt, there's no sauce, it's just boiled meat. Man, it tastes so good. It's hard for the audience to understand how good that tastes when you're that low on food for an extended period of time, but man, does it taste good. So William now has some fish and some rabbit left, and he talks about how he's going to store the rest of his food for later. And instantly, I got worried, because right before commercial break, I mean, what a good teaser by the producers. They show a marten scaling that pole that he just got his food bag hanging off of, and the marten climbs down onto his bag, and it looks like it's going to raid his food bag. Next up on the episode is Dub. You gotta like Dub. You have to admit that he's fun to watch, likable, and he's doing really well, dude. Dub wakes up in his shelter. It's cold and rainy, but again, he's keeping that positive mindset. He's not letting the weather get him down. His next scene is he heads down to check his gill net at the river's edge, and he finds a monster in his gill net. Now, I think that is one of the biggest fish caught on the show. Just a little bit bigger than that monster that Wide caught. It's definitely one of the biggest. I'm not sure exactly how big it is, because again, we're just kind of estimating our sizes out there. And but I know that Jordan Jonas caught a monstrous lake trout that didn't make the edit a few seasons back. I'm not sure how big it was, but I know that was a monster too. So definitely one of the biggest fish caught on the show. Dub makes a really interesting point. He holds up his fish and he goes, man, if I catch 10 more of these, it's going to be close to like getting a big game animal. And if you remember back to season 8 when Clay Hayes got that deer, the caption on the screen said that he harvested 50 pounds of meat off that deer. I mean, do the math, it won't take long to get that much meat when you're catching fish that big. Dub heads down to the river to fetch some water, and he notices a large bull moose across the pond. He rips out a couple cow calls. The moose hears it, seems a little bit interested at first. He wisely dumps his big camera, and he just goes for a little stalk with his GoPro. He's doing some decent cow calls, but the moose, unfortunately, at first it was coming towards him and it was getting exciting, but then it kind of veered off and headed back up into the bush. And Dub was kind of choked because he knew he was losing daylight, and getting a moose in the evening like that, he wouldn't have been able to track it until morning, which would have probably attracted predators if it died, and there's a chance of losing your meat over the night, especially if you can't get the guts out of the animal and you can't get the skin off the animal for an extended period of time. It keeps all that heat in. It doesn't allow the carcass to cool, which expedites the spoiling process. So unfortunately, it was kind of bad timing, but I mean, that's when you see most game. You see most game just before dark, and you see most game just after first daylight. If there is a bull moose in the area and he's rutting like he is, there's a good chance that Dub will have another encounter with that moose, just like Timber had a second encounter with that moose that he saw. Dub heads out the next morning with his bow, trying to lure that moose back in. Unfortunately, there's no sign of that big bull moose. As Dub's heading back to his shelter, he sees the first grouse that he's seen in his time on the show. It's in a tree close to the water's edge. He makes a good shot with his bow, kills the grouse, but unfortunately his arrow went straight through the grouse and went into the lake. I think it was a wise decision, sacrificing an arrow for a grouse. I actually did the same thing as Dub, but unfortunately I missed the grouse that I lost my arrow on, and it ended up like 200 yards into the lake, and I never got that one back. So he plucks the grouse, processes it, and is boiling it up in his pot. Short time later, he notices his arrow in the lake. The broadhead's like down in the water, and you can see the fletch just kind of bobbing on top of the water. So he makes like a retrieval stick on a piece of rope, and he tosses it out there and kind of lassos it and drags it slowly back into the shore, and he retrieves his arrow. Awesome. The next scene with Dub gets really wolfy. He's in the shelter area and he hears a howl. He heads down to the river and he sees, I think it was at least 3 wolves on the other side of the riverbank. He's still, and he's got some great footage of these wolves. Man, when that black wolf stopped on the bank and you could see the size of it, and it stared back at the camera, I'm like, what a great scene that was. Pretty eerie, pretty powerful. You could see how impactful that moment, that wild moment with these wolves was on Dub, and you could tell he was really appreciative of it, and man, what a great experience he had with those wolves. One of Dub's last scenes in this episode was him saying that he feels strong and he has a lot left in the tank. It would appear that Dub is doing really well in this game right now. Up next on the episode is Sarah. Sarah is shown in her shelter with a pot full of some delicious looking gross stew that she's enjoying, and then she's on to reinforcing her shelter. Now I really like that little vestibule section that she's added onto her shelter, like the little walkway. I don't know if she's planning on keeping some of her equipment under that so she has more room in her shelter, or maybe a place to store her firewood. Anyways, I like it. Sarah is feeling much more confident after harvesting those 2 grouse. So Sarah is then pictured harvesting some dry grass. Her idea is she's gonna separate the seeds from the stems, grind it up and make a flour. So she does that. She brings it into her shelter and she grinds it up with a rock. And she adds a bit of water and she ends up with a walnut-sized ball of paste, simulating like dough. And she cooks it up and she consumes it, but she admits she's got a little bit of work to do on her recipe. So it's day 27 and Sarah is having some powerful food fantasies. I mean, they've shown her doing some foraging. She's obviously eating berries and mushrooms and a little bit of grass seed. But if I remember correctly, she's harvested 3 grouse. And that's not a lot of food for that much time. So she's having some really powerful food fantasies and she's dreaming of Chinese food. I remember my food fantasies out there, folks. I mean, they are so powerful. You can't understand unless you're that deprived from calories. I was having dreams, like I was dreaming of going to like sandwich shops and deli shops, and all my fantasies were either sweet or fatty fried foods. My #1 food fantasy out there was Hawaiian pizza. It almost hurt. Like I could visualize like slipping my hand under that hot slice from the cardboard box and pulling it out, and the crunch of pineapple in your mouth, and it was driving me nuts for a time there. Especially near the end, the last 2 weeks was really powerful. Second was Doritos. Sweet chili heat Doritos were killing me. Like I was just, even the tactile feeling of like sticking your hand in a bag of Doritos and just feeling the chips and the smell of them and the crunch in your mouth, like you can't stop thinking about that stuff. And my third biggest fantasy was, I don't know why, because I don't eat them that much, but out there, I was dreaming about peanut M&Ms and sticking your hand in that big giant Costco bag you can get, and just the noise and the feeling of those M&Ms in your hands and just eating them. Oh my gosh, it was pretty intense. So I really understand her food fantasies. Sarah talks about how she's been unable to catch any fish from the river yet. So her focus now is to reinforce some snare wire by braiding it and setting a snare on some of the beaver trails that she knows are down by the river. As always, folks, thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. Tune in next Friday for my recap of episode 8. We'll see you next time.